3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
Welcome to Roots of Reality. I'm your host, Ben Baumann, and today we're going to be talking about Phase 12, the forming of the global economy. So going back about 500 years ago, Europe began to re-emerge as the dominant region of the world, and this was due to the Europeans' desire to form global trade-based empires. And they did this to counter the Ottoman Empire's dominance when it came to the control of trade between Europe and Asia. In turn, with this reemergence, European exploration increased, leading to a defining moment that would change the course of history. So this story begins with the Italian explorer and controversial figure Christopher Columbus, who was hired by Spain to find a route to northern China and India. However, Columbus ended up going the wrong way by accident and ended up sailing to the Caribbean instead. Now, it should be pointed out that Columbus was not the first foreigner to sail to the Americas. The first was actually hundreds of years before Columbus, named Leif Erikson, who was a Scandinavian explorer. The difference, however, was that Columbus's exploration would change the world forever. So before we go any further, we should provide a little bit of clarity and context about why Columbus embarked on this type of journey in the first place. So Christopher Columbus, though Italian, was hired by the Spanish Empire in hopes that he would find gold and spices. And when Columbus arrived in the Caribbean, he did manage to find what he was looking for in terms of gold and spices, but in a totally different part of the world, and not the one that he thought he was in. And the consequences of Columbus's mistake were huge, especially for the indigenous populations of the Americas, because it wasn't too long before European nations realized that what Columbus discovered was in fact a part of the world Europeans did not know even existed previously. Thus, the period of European colonization of the Americas began, and this was led by two major world powers at the time, Portugal and Spain. And at the very beginning of colonization, Spain and Portugal agreed to a deal to create separate spheres of influence in the non-European world. And along with the Americas, this included parts of Asia and Africa as well, and this deal would become known as the Treaty of Tordesillas. Despite this treaty, though, and its significance to Spain and Portugal, it was not respected by the other European powers like the Dutch, English, and French, who soon joined the quest to create their own spheres of influence in the non-Western world via colonization. So like Spain and Portugal, the Dutch Republic, the Kingdom of France, and the Kingdom of England believed in the idea of mercantilism. And this was a growing movement in Europe to counter that Ottoman control of trade between Europe and Asia. Essentially, this means that trade is key to strengthening an empire's power, and the goal of selling more products than products that you buy create greater wealth. Thus, these empires would colonize other parts of the world and exploit their resources, and using these resources to make goods to sell for profit. So the more stuff you sell and the less stuff you have to buy, the better your empire's economy will be and the more powerful your empire will be. And as a result of this colonization by European powers, a truly global economy was formed for the very first time, where the Americas, Europe, Africa, and Asia were all connected economically, and due to this, the world started to change in drastic ways. For example, with the exchange of goods across the world, animals started to be shipped all over the place, along with different types of plants, and even more notable, the spread of disease as well, which tragically devastated populations of the Americas, killing countless people who had no immunity to these diseases for which Europeans, Asians, and Africans had already been exposed to. As a result, these three pillars of the colonial era made up what would be known as the Columbian Exchange. Lastly, not only were populations of the Americas greatly affected by colonization, but also were Africans. This stemmed from what was called the Atlantic slave trade, and the slave trade was part of a more complex triangular trade where wine, textiles, and weapons would be sent by Europeans to Africa, along with other things, and Africans that were captured by other African tribes were then sold by them as slaves to Europeans, who would then take them to the European colonies in the Americas for labor. And sugar and coffee would be sent from these colonies in the Americas to Europe. Therefore, unfortunately, one of history's oldest and most barbaric practices that have haunted our planet since the dawn of human civilization became one of the cornerstones of this early world economy. And overall, this global economy that was created under colonization, which has left the world connected economically ever since, created massive changes. For instance, European empires became wealthy and powerful, but many local indigenous populations of Africa and the Americas suffered in many ways. Sadly, though, as we take a step back and look at the big picture, another key thing to understand is revealed, and that is that the era of colonization and the exploitation it represented was not at all historically unique, but rather just a more organized and systematic exploitation of other societies, which created more influential results. But as a whole, the legacy of colonization and the mentality that the colonizers had towards those they colonized is the same sort of mentality that has plagued human societies since the beginning of civilization on every continent. And that is based around the idea that for whatever reason you feel that your society is somehow superior to another society, and then you use that as justification for the exploitation, enslavement, and conquest of less powerful human societies for personal gain. Historically, as a species, this has been a normal part of human society that began long before the age of colonization by various populations in Europe, the Americas, Africa, and Asia, all over the world. In turn, as citizens of this modern world, it is up to us to examine the past and dare to make sure that the mistakes and tragedies caused before our time in human history are not continuously repeated, because at the end of the day, the world will always change, but how it changes and what changes is up to us. As always, please feel free to comment, like Roots of Reality on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, write a review. It's on all podcast platforms. And remember, 13.8 billion years led to you, so make the most of it.